Hey guys, Vazzy back here, and in today's video, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be doing another testing EA NHL video, but we're going to be testing the simulation speed of every single NHL game going back from NHL 2004 all the way up to current day NHL 25. So you guys will know, if you are a follower of the channel, we made a very small video testing this out between NHL 2004 and NHL 25, a few months ago. And that kind of got me thinking. NHL 2004 smokes NHL 25. So how do all the other games in between fit in that range? That's going to be the question that we try and answer here today. And once again, this kind of goes back to, one of the problems with NHL 25. I know it's definitely by far not a perfect game and a lot of people have issues with it, but the simulation speed this year has just been horrific, and I've seen so many people talking about that online. So we're going to compare that to other games in the franchise, recent and, a little bit further back, and we'll see where this game stacks up. Alright, so we do have some rules for this video here today, just to try and keep things as consistent as possible. I want to start by saying there is 100% a margin of error here. It's not going to be huge though, it's going to be, probably a few seconds every simulation, but there is definitely a margin of error just when it comes to pop-ups and stuff like that. Always try and get to that stuff as fast as possible, but we are all human here, so it may vary slightly from sim to sim. So that does cover the pop-ups there in the rules. The simulation starts as soon as I hit the simulation start button. Basically, I go to the end of the season in April, and I get to the last day of the season, and whenever I hit start on that last day, that is when the timer will start. And then it'll run until the simulation text is off the screen. Sometimes the season goes all the way to the end, and it looks like, where we basically got through everything, but it still does say simulating, so that timer will run until that pop-up is gone. And basically for this video here today, it's going to be formatted in a way so that we're going to go through each and every single game, but we're not going to sit through each and every single simulation and talk about it as it's going on. I'm going to go and give you, a brief feel of how this game is going. I'll give you the overall result of the simulation speed, and we'll go through it quickly like that. At the end of the video, I'm going to put all the simulations in full, uncut, so if you guys want to go back, check the work, whatever, all the proof is there where I got all the numbers from. That will all be at the end of the video. So with all that being said, let's go and jump into our first game here today, that being NHL 2004. And this is one of the games that we already did go through, and you know how impressive it is, especially for being over 20 years old. NHL 2004 has an insanely quick simulation speed in terms of any NHL game. Comes in with a total simulation time to get a whole season done of 1 minute and 3 seconds. I don't want to spoil anything, but that is going to be one of the most impressive results that we see here today. Very impressive for a game that, like I said, is 20 plus years old. And you can see, just in this short time I've been talking about the game, we're already 50% done, so you can see how fast this really is. Don't want to spend too much time on a game that we've already covered. Let's go jump to NHL 2005. Alright, so we are here with NHL 2005, and you can see it's actually not a horrible speed for the simulation. I'm going to give you guys the total number here that it takes to get the season done in this game. It takes 1 minute and 56 seconds to simulate a season on NHL 2005. That's still very, very quick, but that's still almost a minute slower than the prior year's game. I wonder what's causing that. I wonder if there were a bunch of features added or something like that that, kind of slows everything down in the back end. But overall, NHL 2005, no problems with, 2 minutes, under 2 minutes and getting a season done. That is a perfect range for me in all of these games. So far, so good. 2 games down, let's move on to NHL 2006. Alright, so small spoilers here with NHL 2006. I have all the numbers here in front of me. This is going to be the last really, quick, good simulation here for quite a number of years, which is very unfortunate. And it's weird, this is the last game, I believe, released on the original Xbox. Actually, I lied, we do have NHL 2007 on the current version, but this is, the last full version released on the old generation of consoles. This game clocks in at 2 minutes and 12 seconds to get the season done. So once again, it is definitely slower than the prior two, but anywhere around that 2 minute mark I'm fine with. With it being an extra 10-20 seconds, I don't really care that much. So NHL 2006, honestly, once again, is fine. But moving over to NHL 2007, and this is the Xbox, or original Xbox version, I should say. This is the last game we'll be looking at on that system of console. And it's very, very interesting. This is where I think the series, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I don't know what additions came this year, but it really seemed to slow the game down. So in 2006, we went from 2 minutes and 12 seconds to get a season done in this year's game was over 5 minutes. 5 minutes and 10 seconds. That's more than double the time to get a season done. And this is definitely not the worst result we're going to be seeing here in this generation of games, and I really don't know why, especially with it being on the original Xbox. You think maybe the version on the 360, for whatever reason, it's not optimized, and maybe that's why it's slower. But yeah, I'm very puzzled of why this game seems like it is so slow. But that is NHL 2007 on the original Xbox. Let's go jump over and see how it performs on the 360. Alright, so same game, different console. And very similar results, I should say. Once again, it is slower, which again does kind of make me question it as well. You think maybe the new system would have better hardware that can run the game better. Apparently not. It's similar. Comes in at a total of 6 minutes and 4 seconds compared to 5 minutes and 10 seconds of the original Xbox version. So once again, that's more or less a full minute slower. And I don't really know why that would be the case. Your guess is as good as mine. And yeah, I don't know. NHL 2007 was definitely a weird game here for both of these consoles. Let's go move to NHL 08 and let's see if EA had any progress in speeding up the simulation. Alright, so we are here at the next year, NHL 2008. We got the new revamped hub here for franchise mode. Unfortunately, simulation speed was not fixed this year. NHL 2007 went from 6 minutes and 4 seconds to NHL 2008 staying at a very similar mark, putting up a number of 6 minutes and 16 seconds. Once again, it seems odd that there would be no progress made on this game, at least after the year moving to the new console. And yeah, I don't know. 6 minutes and 16 seconds seems like a lot, especially just, 4 years ago we were at 1 minute and 3 seconds. So definitely not the best point for the series here. Let's go move on to NHL 2009 and see if that can finally get improved upon here with the Xbox 360. So up until this point, each and every single game that we have looked at basically made the game slower. For whatever reason, NHL 2009 is a bit of an outlier here. You can just see here, going through the menus, it's not fast by any means, but comparing it to 2007, 2008, it definitely is an increase in speed, and that shows in the numbers. NHL 2009 comes in with a record of 4 minutes 24 seconds to get a season done, compared to 6 minutes and 16 seconds the prior year. That's a nice little improvement. Ideally, again, we still do hope for more. We should be making more progress. The more tech we get, the further we get into different console generations. But hey, it is the first time in this whole video here today that we have seen progress toward the EA NHL series. Let's go see in NHL 10 if they can continue with this momentum, if they're going to take another step back. Alright, so we have NHL 10 loaded up here, and I'll give you the numbers right away. So honestly, it is a step back, but it's not awful, let's just say. Not yet, anyway. We are getting there. We're getting there very, very soon. NHL 2010 went from a time to get the season done from 4 minutes and 24 seconds in 2009 to in 2010, 5 minutes and 8 seconds. So that's almost another minute that we've tacked back on there to get a season done. Once again, I really wonder year to year what's causing this difference. What caused us to make progress last year, where this year we're stepping back another whole minute? In a minute, it's not a whole lot of time, but if you're trying to get a bunch of seasons done, it does add up, and it just makes the game feel more laggy, more slow, and less enjoyable overall. So that's NHL 2010, a step back unfortunately. Let's see if NHL 2011 can fix that mistake. Alright, so NHL 11 here, unfortunately I do have bad news for you guys once again here, as it is another step back for the franchise and another step down for the simulation speed of this game. So this year's game went from 5 minutes and 8 seconds the prior year, to this year going another minute back, pushing the game to 6 minutes and 18 seconds to get a season done. That puts us at our slowest time yet, beating NHL 2008 at 6 minutes and 16 seconds. And yeah, like, what honestly is causing this? Are they just adding too much stuff to franchise mode? I don't really remember what the improvements are and what was coming year to year that would cause that, but there has to be something that's slowing that down. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And you can even just see, like, as we're going through the weeks here, I'm not showing the whole thing right now, but you can just see it feels like it is a little bit on slow motion. I'm curious to see and find out what would be causing that. That's NHL 11. Let's go to the next year's game, that being NHL 12. NHL 12, one of my personal favorite games, just the memories of this game. This is really one of my favorite games in the series for whatever reason, I don't know why. NHL 12, though, once again takes another step back. That is, 3 games in a row that we have not been able to make an improvement here when it comes to simulation speed. We went from 6 minutes and 18 seconds in NHL 11 to 6 minutes and 53 seconds in NHL 12. So we're almost at the 7-minute mark. And I'm not going to say exact numbers right now, but we are about to fall off a cliff here as we move on to NHL 13 and beyond. So let's go jump to that and let's look at what happened. Okay, so far in this video we've seen it kind of, go up and go down. We've seen some games where it's made progress, and we've seen some games where it's slowed down, a minute or so every now and then. So NHL 12, once again, was a step back, 6 minutes, 53 seconds. NHL 13, I don't know what the heck they did with this game or the next few games. Honestly, I don't know. We went from 6 minutes and 53 seconds to 12 minutes and 26 seconds. That is absurd. We're doubling the time yet again to get through an entire season on this game. I legitimately don't know what would cause that. And the fact that it stayed at a very similar mark for the next few years' games, I don't know how that wasn't addressed. And yeah, I don't know. We think it's bad in current days games, as fun as these older games were, and I love them. But yeah, this is just absolutely awful when it comes to the speed of these games. Alright, moving over to everybody's favorite game now, being NHL 14. Again, the memories with this game. Overall, is it a great game? Yeah, it definitely is. It's definitely one of the high points in the NHL series. Is that going to follow the trend for today's video? No, it is not. I'm going to say something right now. This is the slowest game on today's list. Again, there's a margin of error. I'm sure some of these games I'm assuming they're all going to be pretty similar if you look at exact speed, if you're 100% getting everything perfect. But honestly, this is insane. We went from 12 minutes 26 seconds to 13 minutes and 40 seconds. Again, that's 2 years on from being at 6 minutes 53 seconds, which is on from a few years of being 1 minute and 3 seconds. And honestly, just looking at it now, just looking at these games and how amazing they were and how much fun they are to go back to. I love going back to these older games. I'm working on NHL Legacy Edition, a side project, trying to update it and, make it more realistic to current day. But it's just so tough to, at least for me, making videos on this because it's so slow to get everything done. At least even compared to NHL 25, which isn't fast at all. But when you put it up against something like this, it's 10 minutes slower, which is just absolutely crazy for sure. So that's NHL 14. Let's go move over to NHL 15, specifically the Xbox 360 version. Alright, so more or less 2015 is where everything started going wrong with the NHL series. NHL 15 on the 360, though, definitely did survive that issue, at least for one more year. How was it when it came to the simulation speed, though? It is an improvement. It's not good by any means. It comes in at a time of 13 minutes and 5 seconds, so more or less shaving off 30 seconds from NHL 14. Once again, is that good? Is that fun? Is that overall acceptable? I say no, especially where we've been at and where we are at now, at least in the terms of this video, but that is just me. Let's go and look at NHL 15 for the Xbox One. As awful as that game was, let's see if any improvements were made with new technology. NHL 15 on the Xbox One. I was lucky as a kid. I ended up avoiding this game. I stayed on the 360 build. But yeah, this game is definitely not a good game at all. But how was it in terms of simulation speed? Especially, how does it compare to NHL 15 on the Xbox 360? Let's go take a look. And it actually made phenomenal progress. So, such progress that we have not seen yet in today's video. NHL 15 on the Xbox One is the one positive thing that we're going to end up seeing from this game probably ever. Coming in at a time to get a season done at 4 minutes and 36 seconds. That is a huge improvement over the 13 minutes and 5 seconds that we had on the 360. And once again, it's expected. We're getting new technology, we should have had this, in the Xbox 360 days, in my opinion. Honestly, even if you would have kept it around 5 to 7 minutes, I think that would have been acceptable for consoles of that day. Again, I know you're trying to add to the game, you're trying to make it better, and that is going to slow certain aspects down. But to make a very decent step here in the first year of that new transition to new technologies and new consoles, I actually do say this is the one positive thing I'll ever say probably about NHL 15. Let's go move over back to the 360 here for the last time. Let's go take a look at NHL Legacy Edition. Alright, so back on the 360 here. Not going to spend too much time on Legacy Edition here. I think the result is pretty expected, at least from what we've seen, in today's video, what the trend has been. NHL Legacy Edition comes in at a total time of 13 minutes and 6 seconds. So if you guys didn't know, this was basically the Xbox 360 version of NHL 16. They basically just threw one more game out there for the 360 users. If you hadn't jumped over to the new consoles yet, you could still play the NHL games with updated rosters, and it was basically NHL 16 without it being in name. So, with that being the last game of the 360 era, let's go once again jump over to the Xbox One. Let's go take a look at NHL 16, the real NHL 16 here. Alright, so back on the newer generation of Xbox consoles here with NHL 16, and I have some very, very good news for you here today, as this is the fastest simulation time that we have got in, I want to believe, 10 years here, since NHL 2006. That game came in at 2 minutes and 12 seconds. NHL 16 had a very surprising time of 2 minutes and 31 seconds. Again, that is totally acceptable. Anywhere around that 2 to 3 minute mark, I think is fine. I'd honestly probably prefer, at least with today's technology and how everything is today, 2 minutes. I would say try and get your game down to 2 minutes to get everything done and get a season over with. You compare that to, games like MLB The Show. They're insanely fast for that, and they've been known for that for years upon years now. So 2 minutes is always kind of a target for me, but it's good to see that we're moving back toward that 2 minute range. Let's go jump over to NHL 17 and see if it continues with that progress, or if there's going to be another step back for the franchise. Alright, so we are here with NHL 17, and this is now the third year of new consoles. We went from 4 minutes 36 seconds to 2 minutes 31 seconds with NHL 16. Does that trend of positivity continue with NHL 17? Unfortunately, it doesn't. It's not egregious, it's still a very solid time, at least for, the games in this era. And it's a lot better than what we had on the 360, but it is definitely a little bit slower than what we saw last year. It comes in at a time of 3 minutes and 1 seconds, so basically means it comes in at, 30 seconds more or less slower. And I believe this is the year that they added the expansion draft, stuff like that, so there was a decent amount actually getting added to franchise mode, so I can kind of forgive that a little bit, at least when you're at least adding a decent amount to the game. If that slows it down a little bit, at least for a year, I guess it's somewhat acceptable. 3 minutes isn't too bad overall. Let's go move to NHL 18 and see if that can be optimized whatsoever. Good news for you guys here, as NHL 18 did make a very decent step forward when it comes to the simulation speed of this game. So we came in at 3 minutes and 1 seconds, which was a step back, to our first time under 2 minutes since NHL 2005. That's insane it took us that long. But we clocked in at a time here of 1 minute and 53 seconds. This was a game that, again, I, for whatever reason, just had a lot of fond memories of. I don't know, I see very mixed reviews of any of these games, from NHL 15 onward. Again, it's very mixed in the reception of whatever and things, but for whatever reason, I did have a lot of fun with this game myself. And hey, It was a game that at least actually, somewhat did perform. You could get stuff done. You could get stuff done very fast. So once again, NHL 18, that's a success. Let's see if NHL 19 can build upon it, or if we're going to slow down whatsoever. So moving over to NHL 19, I don't have too much to say here today. It did slow down slightly. It's nothing really that much of note. Went from 1 minute 53 seconds to 2 minutes and 5 seconds. Once again, totally within that acceptable range. And yeah, I could very well be down to a margin of error. I don't think it would be, 10 seconds more or less, but once again, it's close enough to say 2 minutes is totally all in good for NHL 19. Let's go over to NHL 20. NHL 20, very, very surprising number, which I do not remember. So let's go take a look at it. So this to me was probably one of the more surprising results. So you think 2 minutes more or less, how much more optimized are you gonna get? From 2 minutes and 5 seconds. NHL 20, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I don't even remember it being this fast, comes in at 1 minute and 9 seconds. That is the second fastest game we've looked at here today, just a touch slower than NHL 2004 by 6 seconds, so very, very comparable. Like, I don't remember this game going so fast and being able to get things done this quick. I just kind of expected it would stay around the 2 minute average, but no. They made great work, and they really did optimize this game. For whatever reason, this was definitely one of the peaks of the modern NHL game series, at least when it comes to simulation speed. So let's go move to NHL 21 and see how this is responded to. So coming off one of the highs of the video here today, can we continue on with that trend with NHL 21? We cannot, but it is still a very, very respectable result. If we could get anything like this, in NHL 26, I would be ecstatic. So it comes in at 10 seconds slower, from 1 minute 9 seconds to 1 minute 19 seconds. Once again, totally okay. Let's go move over to NHL 22 as we look at our final 4 games as we close out today's video. So NHL 22 is actually the only game we can't really look at here when comparing it to old gen and new gen, from Xbox One, I believe it was, to current day consoles. I have it on another account, but for whatever reason it wasn't letting me capture, so we're just going to be doing it on the newer version of the game here today. And once again, very respectable speed. Does slow down about 30 seconds or so from, the prior year, from NHL 21 of 1 minute 19 seconds to 1 minute and 48 seconds here with NHL 22. Once again, totally fine. If we can stay around this mark here, that would be totally alright in my books. Alright, so 3 more games here to look at. NHL 23 up next, and again, I don't have much to say here with these newer games. NHL 23 ties NHL 22 exactly. 1 minute 48 seconds to 1 minute 48 seconds. Total consistency here, and once again, I've been saying it throughout the video. Totally within the range of acceptability, at least for me. But once again, let's not waste time here. 2 more games to look at. One I have quite a bit to say about, and one is, more or less pretty standard. Alright, so NHL 24, it doesn't feel like all that long ago that we were making videos, putting out rosters for this game. But yeah, this was a game that once again follows the trend of the prior 3, really, from NHL 22 to NHL 24. There was virtually no change in speed. From 1 minute 48 seconds the prior 2 games to 1 minute 51 seconds, which once again is very much in that range of error. That could totally be on me, just, losing a few seconds here or there. And yeah, once again, not much to say for NHL 24. I wish we could have NHL 24 speed and NHL 25. Unfortunately, we cannot, and it's not even that close. Let's go move over to NHL 25. We got to go have a discussion here around this game. Alright, so the last game we're here to look at here today, and this is really a big part of my frustration here with current day games. So we've been making very good progress, really, from NHL 15 really on the Xbox One onward. I know NHL 15 on Xbox One, definitely don't call it fast, 4 minutes 36 seconds, but we've been seeing upward progress from those 360 days to having some really fast games from NHL 20 to really, NHL 24 I would still consider being very good, very smooth, very fast game. So we went from that to NHL 25 doing a huge revamp of franchise mode, adding a ton of new features, stuff that we've been asking for years, which is great. But we also have to, kind of ask at what cost did that come to the mode in general? Like, Again, it's a simulation speed. Is it the biggest issue in the world? Absolutely not. But it just makes everything feel slow and makes things just not feel very fun overall. So NHL 25, drumroll here, comes in at a total of 4 minutes and 15 seconds, which is more than double what NHL 24 came in at. And very interesting to say, NHL 25, when we did this test 3-4 months ago, whatever it is now, came in at 10 seconds slower. So I don't know if that's actual progress that they've made. Again, 10 seconds is not a lot. I hope for quite a bit more, but is that something that they've been able to achieve through patches, or is that, once again, just a margin of error, me being faster or slower in one sim? I don't know. But yeah, overall, it's just something that it definitely seems like this year is a big step back, and it's definitely something that we shouldn't be experiencing at this point. Everything's getting better, everything's getting more powerful and strong. Like I've been saying, we've been seeing this in the video here throughout the different console generation leaps. And yeah, it's definitely disappointing to see for sure. So let's go wrap up today's video. I put everything into a nice little line graph here that visualizes everything that we have seen so far here today. And there you go. There is the highs and the lows of the NHL series. From the god-awful performance of the Xbox 360 era games, as amazing as those games were, they are very, very slow, to the progress that we've seen in recent years before NHL 25, all displayed here nicely on this graph. And yeah, this is something that I've, wanted to test for quite a while now, just to get some of these numbers, just kind of put it in perspective of where we've come from, where we've gone, the improvements and the declines that we've seen throughout the years. But overall, I think that is going to do it for today's video, looking at all the different simulation speeds from NHL 2004 to NHL 25. Like I said, end of the video here is probably going to be like an hour of just raw footage of everything. I'm going to try and timestamp it all for you guys, just if you want to check anything out and see where I'm getting these numbers from, or just if you want to see a general kind of speed of an in particular game, whatever it may be, all that footage will be here for you guys over the next probably hour and a half or so. But overall, that is going to do it for me here today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.